Here we go. Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Essential Reference and Master Data Management. This is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we'll be collecting them via the Q&A section. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, Zoom chat defaults to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to network with everyone. And to open the Q&A or the chat panel, you may find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link of the recording of the session as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an acknowledged data management authority and associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of Data International, and associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 12 books are many firsts, starting before Google, before data was big, and before data science. Peter has founded several organizations that have helped more than 200 organizations leverage data-specific savings, which have been measured at more than 1.5 billion US dollars. His latest is Anything Awesome. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Shannon. It's so good to be here, everybody. I understand it may be sort of typical Northwest weather where you are, Shannon, but we've got a very nice day here on the East Coast. And hopefully everybody else is enjoying wherever they happen to be. I started out because, of course, ChatGPT and the AI generators have been so popular these days. And I took the title, Essential Reference and Master Data, and just dropped it into Bing, and this is what it came up with here, which really isn't very helpful. And I think it's actually somewhat indicative because I did a different AI engine and got this picture, which I think is actually rather nice. I'm still not sure exactly what it's trying to convey here, but this is really what we're trying to do collectively, is understand what are these two concepts, how are they related, and how do they relate to the rest of the data that you have. And it turns out the title is slightly incorrect here. I'm going to make the change right now and say essential reference and master data. And with that, we'll move into the program overview here, where we're going to first talk about how reference and master data fit in to data management overall. Then we'll look specifically at what are the terms reference and master data management, focusing on why are they important, because it is a very important starting point. In fact, it's one of the most important building blocks. And so we'll talk about those a little bit on guiding principles and best practices, but those are mainly checklists for you. Give you a couple of takeaways here, and then of course we'll get to the Q&A section. So let's dive right in. I like to start off when talking about data management by reminding us all of the discussions that we had in high school about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is to say that if you have physiological needs or food, clothing, and shelter needs that are unmet, it is impossible to be safe. And if you are never safe, then you'll never be part of something that is bigger than yourself, society, family, et cetera, et cetera. And if you can't ever be part of something that's bigger than yourself, then you never know yourself relative to the other pieces, boundaries, self-esteem, concepts around that, which eventually get us to the concept of self-actualization. And the reason I like to introduce this pyramid here is because it relates very precisely to data management and the way in which we need to think about approaching it. It is impossible to achieve the level 4 safety without first being safe and, having food, clothing, and shelter needs met. And again, each one is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to getting to the top concept, which is quite frankly where we'd all like to work as human beings. The TED people hijacked this term a while back and called it now flow, but self-actualization is the same concept in the Maslow world here. And the reason I think it's important to start talking about data management there is because when we look at this thing that's in the golden triangle here, and if I wanted to enhance the diagram or make it more modern, I could add Bitcoin and blockchain and things like that to here, which really do still fall into that same category of just being the tip of the iceberg, and that without knowing that you have to do at least these 5 foundational data management practices, it isn't possible to recognize that the things in the golden triangle there are literally just technologies. I don't mean that in any way bad, but technologies are important, but they're more useful in the context of organizational capabilities. And that's what I want you to think of as the bottom of the iceberg that represents the vast majority. In fact, between 20 and 40% of all IT spending can be tied to data evolution activities. And people often look at this and say, well, gosh, Peter, this is wonderful, but I need you to do it faster. Can you speed up the process? Because we'd like to get both technologies and capabilities online in a way that we can make money faster. And that's, an entirely reasonable proposition. But if I increase my speed, it will take longer, it will cost more, it will deliver less, and it will present greater risk. Again, thank you, Tom DeMarco, for those wonderful, concise ways of describing why that is the wrong choice and why you should, in fact, invest in this, because it is a literal iceberg field out there, or minefield, or whatever you want to think of it as. And you want to negotiate and invest your resources carefully. Master data management is, of course, one of the areas that we'll talk about doing this. But let's keep on with our overview of data management. Here, with good acknowledgement to the CMMI Institute, which funded the research here, is a very good way of describing data management succinctly. Data management consists of 5 practice areas: managing the data coherently, managing the assets professionally, giving a proper life cycle approach, maintaining fit for purpose quality, and also with the right architecture in that type of a context. Of course, we need supporting processes here as well in order to make this work. And while that is a good description of this, it is important to recognize that we can and have, in fact, studies, much literature showing that this framework works out well. It's everybody gets 1 point for showing up. It's kind of like the participation trophy there. But if you can give evidence that you have managed your data management resources, you get 2 points. If you've defined them or documented them, you get 3 points. If you measure the results of the things that you document, which are the things that you manage, you get 4 points on the scale. And if you use those measurements to optimize those practices, you can get 5 points around this. Most organizations are somewhere between a 2 or a 3, although notice we don't give scores of 2-point anything here. You're either a 2 or you're a 3. And it's best not to think of it that way as a overall for the organization, but instead for a part of the organization will achieve certain levels around that. Because what you want to do is find those parts that need it and do them better. The parts that don't need it will attrish on their own. Let me give you an example of this weak link in the chain concept around here. And that is that if I grade these areas, data governance, data quality, data operations, data platform, and the supporting practices at a level 3, which is a very high score, understand. So don't feel badly if you're looking at this and saying, gosh, we're not that defined. Don't worry, most are not. But if the lack of a data management strategy is the main thing that's holding them back, the entire chain in this case will only reach a score of 1. The lowest score drags all the others down to it. It's kind of like getting a D in high school. But of course, you can imagine no matter how well you govern data and how good the quality is with the correct platforms and with the correct operations, if you don't have a strategy, it's going to be kind of a useless exercise. So your data foundations can only be as strong as the weakest link. And most organizations, as they're starting out on their data management journey, focus in on reference and master data area as a key area that they can use to leverage from this point forward. One way to think about this, unfortunately, is that most people have come to data in a different fashion. You all will have a different concept of how other people have had it, kind of like the blind people approaching the elephant. Again, if I get the ears, it's a fan. If I get the trunk, it's a snake. You can read the rest of it there. But data is actually quite similar. In other words, the angle you approach data, the vector, if you will, that you approach data on, tends to be your defining perspective. And that's relatively unfortunate because we don't have a lot of people that have this more holistic perspective. Most have approached it with differing perspectives and knowledge and skills, not knowing that there are, in fact, bodies of knowledge and best practices out there that can help them along their journey much faster. Let me give you a most important example here. I'm talking to you as the president of DAMA International, and I'm going to talk about data management definitions here for a minute. All right, so an unrefined version that we used to use was data management is everything that happens between a data source and a data's use. Well, that's a nice way of describing it, but it's not very precise. It's hard for management to understand the precise value proposition that we put into it. So we've moved a little bit and said maybe what we should do is focus on here the sources and reuses. And that's an important concept too, but it too is not well thought out. And this one isn't either. One of you will come up with a better way of describing this. But for now, data sources come into a part that we sort of consume the data on, ingest it, if you will. And these involve different levels of specialized skills around collection, evaluation, preparation. You can read these again as well. And on the other side, there's the exploitation side. Science, delivery, presenting, storytelling, data storytelling are all important aspects of data management within the entire process. Because of course, we all agree that we should have the same knowledge and skills, be singing off the same sheet of paper, and understanding what the respective skills of the respective teams are so that work can be allocated appropriately. But here's the most important part of this. That gets us to data use. Data is, of course, most valuable when it is reused. And the key here is to build in these reuse concepts as we're building the architecture through and through. Reference and master data are essential leverage components for this entire architecture here. So let's move on a little bit further. What do we mean by reference and master data management? Again, start out here. One of the fun things to do when you're talking to executives is understand what they feel pressure to. And both CIOs and chief data officers feel enormous amounts of pressure to buy stuff. I haven't said it yet, but you will hear me say it several times. 80% of, unfortunately, the problems in data are people and process problems. They're not technology problems. And yet too many organizations invest in technology and hope to get a response that is disappropriate with what they've gotten. There's no concept around vendor promise auditing that says, you know, are you really delivering the results, in fact, that you have promised on this. There are very few organizations I've worked with of the 250 or so that have done that. And the real problem is that there's not as much understanding of something that we should teach every IT professional, as well as data professional, the hype cycle. The hype cycle really relates all the way back to our founding goddess, Lady Ada, if you will, who wrote, considering a new subject, there's frequently a tendency to first overrate what we find to be already interesting or remarkable. And secondly, by a sort of natural reaction to undervalue the state of the true state of the case. So if you don't know who Lady Augusta Ada King was, she's obviously the daughter of Lord Byron, who looked at a weaving loom and foresaw the ability to do complex mathematical problems on a machine that would absolutely be invented in her mind, called a computer. So she does get the starting crown for all of this. And that is actually quite reflected in Gartner's hype cycle. I wonder whether they should be paying her estate for this use of this term. The Gartner hype cycle is well described as a technology trigger. Start something off, cool, I've got a new way of combining something here. And we get to this peak of inflated expectations. Remember, she said it's really wonderful. And then by a sort of second nature, it sucks, which is really hard. And then we have to learn how to use it, which is the case with most of IT. We find out that it has its appropriate use under certain circumstances, but it usually is not the silver bullet that is promised. We'll get to those later on in a second here as well. So let me show you a Gartner 2022 hype cycle for data management here. They, for example, look at something called data mesh and say it's dead. It's never going to make it anywhere in their minds. Again, Gartner's entitled to their opinion, but they certainly haven't been wrong in a lot of the cases. Whereas a data fabric maybe have a little rough patch ahead, but still has potential on the 5 to 10 year horizon around that. If we look at data lakes, they're really close in maturity to master data management, which is an interesting concept. They have made progress faster, and we won't talk about it perhaps today, but they are entirely complementary topics around this. But master data management, notice, has been through the worst and is now on the upward climb. It's a good time to start investing in master data management activities because we understand the practice. We've been through the highs, we've been through the lows. We're now starting to up that slope of enlightenment and attempt to get to the plateau of productivity. The organizations that do it first will attain what's called a sustained competitive advantage around this. So master data management has been a part of the DAMA-DIMBOK wheel right from the very beginning, if you will. If it's the first time you're seeing this, DAMA International produced this articulation of what are the components of data management back ago. This is our second version of it. We're in the process of planning for the third version around all this, but you can see it says reference and master data management. It's got some examples: external codes, customer data, dimension management. What are the dimensions that are going to be important to my sales force to understand the sales reporting that they're going to be getting from this? Would be an example of the type of question here. So within data management, reference and master data management, more important concepts, let's look specifically here at reference data management, which is control over the defined domain values. We call these the vocabularies here. You can read the rest of it. But if we were talking about customer, we might differentiate inarticulately, perhaps, by saying that's a current customer and a potential customer, because we probably don't want to send people that bought something last month a notice that it's on sale this month, just to take a sort of defensive approach to it. And that might be important. So this would be then, don't let anybody use the word customer. Instead, make sure that they qualify it appropriately so we don't make a data mistake around that. And this is a good way of introducing this concept of taxonomies to management, not to say that they really want to get involved, but to say that we will have a controlled vocabulary here. And when we have a new concept, such as an ex-customer, we can decide and have a good conversation about whether it meets our match for how we're treating our current customer or our potential customer. In fact, we can divide our current customers up into residential and commercial, and maybe that's a useful business distinction in there. So this refines our taxonomy slightly. And now we get to the concept of, oh, I'd really like to make a VIP customer. How could we go about doing that? Well, you can see these could be compatible, could be incompatible when you're looking at this. Reference data then, if you will, is used to classify other data or value domain. For example, if we were using standards, in this case ISO 3166, to define Czechoslovakia as CZ, it would refer to that geographic mass that you see on the screen in the upper right-hand corner. However, if we went to January of 1993 and defined it as the Czech Republic by ISO 3166, it would be CZ, but it would be a different landmass, even though we have used the same abbreviation. Similarly, of July 16, CZ would be the definition for it, but again, according to the same standard, now the name has changed. So even that is not a panacea in terms of looking at them. When you look at orders, a category for an order could be new, it could be in progress, it could be closed, it could be canceled. If there's another variant, let us know. Obviously, people go modified. Well, no, that's just a combination of close, cancel, and reissue kind of thing. 2-letter state abbreviations. There's a great Gary Gulman joke out there on YouTube if you get a chance to go watch that. We could look at reference data sets. This is a common mistake that's made in many, many places, which is to say that they want to send information to, in this case, the United Kingdom, so they put the country code as UK. But if they're not using the right standards place, it will not reach there because the proper country code for Great Britain is GB. The key here with reference data, if we have real trouble explaining to it, folks, just say, look, imagine making a data set, a website, and that you're going to use this website to go and make $1 billion. Great, wonderful stuff, right? Well, would you rather build in the ability to do multi-currency, multi-company, multicultural, multi-language after you've become successful, or would you build it in right up front? Of course, the answer should be building it in right up front. Well, the work up here in reference data, as you'll see in a very short amount of time, is fundamental to that. If you don't build it in at the reference data set, it can be problematic to add it later on. Let me give you now an example of master data. Master data might be the example that these are business entities providing context for the transactions, but they're not necessarily limited to the predefined values, which are the ones in the reference data. These instead dictate allowable formats and ranges. Again, here you can see, but the key is to provide context for transactions. It comes from the term master file. Now, goodness gracious, in today's environment, people are asking questions, should we still call it master file? I've got some organizations that are saying that implies control over it, and that actually is the purpose of it, is to control over it, but it's a technical control in the way of doing this. I've seen Golden highlighted as a potential on this as well. It's going to be challenging to come up with another name for it. Let's apply ourselves and see if we can, but at least for the moment, it's master data around this. And the idea is the transaction processing system. So let's say I decide I want to go to Potbelly for a $5 luncheon sandwich in here, and my balance in my checking account before I go and use the debit card is $100. So both the transaction and my previous balance go into this update program that then produces a new balance of $95. And if it's a well-designed program, and I have to say, you need to be on the lookout for this to find things that are incorrect. There needs to be something that goes through and said, we achieved some unexpected results. I'll give you an example of one just very quickly, and that is that a gentleman who was at a terminal that issued the command, and the command went and changed his and his wife's grades. There was nothing that they could prove wrong, but the program that was supposed to update his grades found that out, and that's the only way the error in his ways, if you will, was discovered about it. Just slight deviation there, but these are all good ways of approaching these architecturally such that you'll have the ability to look at them properly. So reference data versus master data, again, control over these vocabularies, the standardized terms, the unique identifiers on here. On the right, I've issued something that I have a paper out that if you're interested in, happy to send it to you. It's about what the required gender codes were at the time that the activity took place. And you can see, according to this chart, there were 9 required by both the FBI and the Canadian Social Security system, under which this law was definitely tried in order to do that. The fact, the reference data is the fact that we maintain these specific gender codes, because that means anybody in the Canadian system can access these codes and use them in the way in which they're supposed to. The master data aspect of this would then be the control over the values to enable consistent and shared contextual use across it, as in the golden source of the gender of your customer, Pat, whatever that happens to be. Both of these, of course, provide context for the transaction. So let's go to our definitions now. Again, planning, implementation, and control activities that are consistent with the golden version of contextual data data vals, as opposed to the much more popular than us, folks. Sorry, that's just the reality. Mobile device management that's there. It's a very sad respect, but our stuff, as much as we love data, it ain't the most important stuff out there, just the same way as there are more chief digital officers out there than there are chief data officers right at the moment, although the numbers are close. Really key to this entire approach, and if you take away nothing else from today, I'd like you to take this away, which is that the idea that MDM is a strategy, it's a discipline, it's an approach to doing this. Too many organizations simply buy something and assume they have got it. And again, that's the silver bullet scenario that we want to avoid. It's the core set of identifiers for the parties, places, and things in your organization. And the more you focus on those pieces and get that part of data right, the easier everything else will be. Notice I'm not promising you easy. I simply said easier. So why are these important? Well, let's start out with reference data here. Again, these are the allowable values, and it's a tiny piece as represented by that tiny yellow dot in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It might be questions like countries we do business, types of accounts that are available, controlled vocabulary items of one sort or another. But that reference data controls or manages, if you will, constrains, provides context for the master data, such as questions such as, are you a member of our premium club? Are you authorized to use this particular activity that you're doing? Are there common data structures that are adapted? And you can see that small amount of reference data controls a larger amount of master data, but the two of them together control the transactional data around the world, like that $5 for my Potbelly sandwich, the authorized piece that says I am authorized to use that particular piece, or even something as simple as a like on Facebook, all the way around. Master data management can make data governance easier. Again, not promising easy. Very quick, slight deviation, but an important part of it. If you're doing master data management without addressing strategy, it is problematic from the very start. The word strategy was not even used certainly in business until about 1950, when business consultants grabbed it and wrote all sorts of books. I'm going to quote my colleague John Ladley on this one, which I think is the best definition of strategy. Instead of it being a master plan by itself and a standalone, data strategy should be the data chapter of your organizational strategy. End of story. And I like that a lot, John. It might have saved me writing a book on it if I'd heard it earlier, but oh well. The key is, before we look at it from John's perspective, look at it from the management consultant perspective, strategy is a thing. And that's not really very helpful. Instead, the best way to think of strategy is its military use originally, which was where the decision came from in the first place, which is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And that takes strategy and brings it to a process as opposed to a thing. The key, of course, is to understand that the processes are iterative and that we expect to get better at it as we do more with it around the world. I'm going to tell you an unfortunate story that is somewhat apocryphal, sorry, in this way, and that has happened to more than one of the groups that I've worked with over here. They go in and they spend a lot of money. I've seen people spend 7 and 8 figures on MDM systems from the best and the brightest. And these are good systems. Please don't misunderstand me. They work really, really well. But unfortunately, you'll see later on that just having the tool is not the way to use this, because the users were never educated as to the role that the MDM was going to play in there. They didn't know how to use it in the context of the business. So they said the first effort collapsed. Literally, I could walk the halls of this organization, I should say, Cube Farms to be more accurate, of this organization, and hear people saying things like, well, I couldn't figure out where to stick the data, so I stuck it in the MDM. And you've lost when you hear that right away, because people really don't understand. So there was general agreement that they should restart the effort, and the root cause analysis that they did with the consensus was that there was poor quality data, as well as the inadequate training on this. So the response from management was, all right, get data qualitying it. And again, they had relatively immature data management practices. They purchased a data quality tool, which gave them sort of 1.5 legs on the stool that they need to stand on. You'll see in just a little bit that you really need 3 legs in order to stand on things properly. And the reason, of course, because all of you understand garbage in, garbage out, bad data plus anything awesome is still going to be bad results along the way. Again, the interdependencies should be apparent, but aren't always, between data governance, which makes the case and is responsible for data quality, which then is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to success of master data initiatives that capabilities constrain the governance effectiveness, and they help organizations leverage around this. So there's a wonderful interdependency around these, and these are good guidance to take away when looking at the DIMBOK in general, which was the idea that in what you're doing in activities, they probably are not going to be just within one pie slice here, as people refer to them, but instead that you're likely to involve 3, because that's the number of legs that you need in order to stand on a table around it. So here's one where we've euphemistically called this the data strategy, and we're saying that the data quality management, data governance, and reference data management are aspects of the solution, and those are activities, business areas that we should engage in developing the master data management solution. That is the end result here, but will not be achieved by simply doing just reference and master data. Instead, looking at integrated quality and integrated governance. And notice also everybody gets 1 point for participation. I don't mean to make light of it in that sense. They have done one aspect of each of these 3 different pie slices, which is a great way for your team to get expertise. Notice that first diagram was labeled iteration 1, implying that there would be others, and you are not surprised. So we go to the second one and we find out we do some more reference and master data, but now we've discovered that we need to incorporate metadata management activities in that process. Notice we also are doing still more data governance. So we have 2x experience points in each of those areas and 1 experience point in metadata, and we still have not lost anything that we had in our first approach around this. Iteration number 3, then generally what ends up working around this, and this is not that you're planning to build them. I'll show you a little bit later on. There's actually a way of easing your organization into these quite nicely. But now everybody said, okay, we really need to look at this from an architectural perspective because of the specific problem for this organization. Nothing at all wrong with it, but do you see, more importantly, how these groups of the data management activities, the practice areas that we've outlined in the DIMBOK, need to be combined and integrated in a lightweight sense so that everybody can understand all of these. The consultants like to say our methodology. I like to say, look, realistically, in terms of beginning to play with master data management, shouldn't use the word play, but really it is the thing that is completely under your control, is to look at this for these 3 legal stools and select 3 practice areas. Again, we've looked at these and said, no, pick that one and that one, and governance around that as a way to go around it. And let's see what can be done in that context. And I'm going to give you a very brief example here. This is an organization that was buying an ERP. And the ERP, the Enterprise Resource Planning Program, SAP, PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, Oracle, they all make wonderful software around these things. The only problem with this particular software that they were looking at to purchase was that it described every time liquid was transferred from one tank to another tank to be a retail sale. And the organization had the choice of modifying the software, which could have been expensive and risky from a number of perspectives, and we can deal with those in the Q&A, or of changing the way they spoke about tanks. And just as the example I gave you earlier, where I said the organization stopped using the word customer by itself, but instead retail customer, residential customer, qualified customers, they agreed internally to use tanks and not use the word tank at the low end, but to use the qualifications around it so that each of these things became the type of tank, and they could use this better qualified metadata to do their accounting for them in an automatic fashion, as opposed to having to modify the software, because of course they had other things that were tanks. For example, each of these things that I've just shown you on there do not represent a retail sale, whereas the first two might in fact represent, depending on what business you're in and how things work. And of course, we don't want to get the word tank confused with the word tank, which we can see in the upper left-hand corner there, is a completely different type of thing. And there's a great story about tanks and master data as well around that, but I can't tell you this one on this one. We just don't have time. Let's look at, first of all, why has this started to occur in organizations? That's because we built our organizations by paving the cow paths. We don't mean anything bad. Great people were involved in creating some of these systems, and they were astounding. There's a payroll system in Air Force Base in Texas, Andrews, I think, that had created a phenomenal set of metadata around it that was unbelievable system. Creativity was off the charts for these folks. These people invented virtual memory before this was invented around this. But my point is that each of these systems that you create around comes with their own piles of data, and that's logical, and it's the way the organization grew up. If we had to do it over again, we would have designed it, of course, for integration, which is the idea behind the ERPs. And all you have to do is somehow get your data into theirs. Where you are likely in your organizations now is that there's some combination of confusion and difficulties of moving data around in ways that are not managed well, which means you can save money on it by just starting to manage it. And more importantly, by restructuring around things that allow us to look at where can we go with respect to managing metadata. Right now, for example, the payroll may have the golden sources, the master data for where people data is, because people tend to like their pay to be correct around it, but not always the case. And again, the discussions that have happened between that and personnel data I've seen over the years will astound you around this. So figuring out how that works is a manner of getting over to it. Again, most organizations approach it by sort of a big bang approach. We're going to go buy a package and convert to it. Now let's talk about what these packages involve. Again, very difficult to look at it from that perspective, but if I have a practice of stewardship in the organization, those business data stewards, one of their responsibilities is to manage the codes that are used organization-wide. And these organizational codes are then propagated to the reference database of record, where we store all of our information about codes so that the organization is able to get to it. And then various systems reach out and grab that information from them so that they go into where data is analyzed in order to look at that. Similarly, there may be updated data that comes in on a subscription basis. This is known as data leakage, or the book I'm reading right now is called Data Theft. Hang on, I gotta tell you this one. This is quite worthwhile. There we go. It is Data Trafficking, which is a very interesting book around all of that. So that's reference. Master data is going to be the same thing, except that notice we've taken the stewards out of the picture, and that this is really worked around by different data stewards. Stewards, remember, are people that are responsible for data. Don't let people own your data. It will be very difficult because you'll find that data has multiple owners, but that gets into another whole discussion there as well. Notice the almost perfect duplication of the original architecture. And of course, looking at it from an overall perspective, you can see that it's very easy to have these things as what you'd like them to be. The challenge is getting there and how we get there. And there's a bug in the process. My first database teacher, Paul Fuse, started out class by saying every good thing has a rock in it. And I remember and wrote that down in my database book that I still have. The rock in this process is that if we do it strictly from a technology perspective and forget about process, we have a completely different set of constructs that are there. So a task orientation is the idea that I'm going to make something and I do it in a series of steps, think assembly line along those lines, and that there may be a series of small set of taskings that are organized together into a process that allows us then to understand overall what's going on in this organization. And we've got some descriptions. Now, remember that 1 in 10 organizations actually manages their process architecture. So if you have an organization that is managing these things, consider yourself in the top 10% of organizations and maturity around those. What we need to look at, however, is reorienting those tasks. Those tasks were built over time. And we are not taught as human beings to always add things to solutions. Excuse me, we are taught as human beings to always add things to solutions. Whereas in many cases, the answer is to subtract, and finding non-value added processes has long been a goal of various types of business processes, to reunify the tasks around a coherent process. What else needs to be part of the analysis? Well, business rules allowing information to appear in multiple places at one time, customer shopping, which might be considered illegal under certain circumstances. Let me give you a very specific example. This is one that we were directly involved with. In the source system from where this was coming, all of the information that was required was on one screen of information, making it very easy for the customer service representative to service the customer in this case. However, in the proposed replacement system, the same information was spread across 23 screens. Yes, you need to re-engineer your processes then if you're going to implement that software without change around it. And change, again, can be expensive and risky, taking a look at it as well. There are some automated business discovery tools that don't spit out process maps, but there are places on the web that you can feed these bits of information to. I've noted one of them up here on the slide, and they will give you information that leads you in the direction of how long did things take, and these things seem to repeat itself. And you can see here, again, even including percentages and things like that. Very, very useful information that can help you organizationally then to figure out what is the order in which things should occur. And this type of process analysis, as I mentioned, is only done in 1 in 10 organizations, which is truly unfortunate, but it really presents a challenge around the master data management, because if the master data management isn't focused on complementing the existing process architecture, then you'll have a mismatch around that. And I'm going to give you the example of the mismatch here as one that came out of a traditional old problem that many of you all have heard me talk about, which is my wonderful 2005 Prius. And many of you are sick of me describing it, and that's someday, sir, it will die, but it certainly hasn't at the moment. Let's go to Toyota and figure out what Toyota was trying to fix in inventing the Prius in 2005. This is the old gasoline engine that they had. I have a 4-speed. It's a very small engine in there. And this is the old dashboard screen from the old Prius. This was the physical engine, the part I just showed you, and this was the electric motor. And I remember having a hard time at first saying, I'm trying to be good to the planet by getting a car that gets great gas mileage, but it's got 2 engines inside it. Now, of course, what this doesn't show is that Toyota had managed to make this a hybrid engine. And in the new system, they are the same engine. They are not different components the way they were 3 generations back. Notice also here the battery. Now what I'm going to do is show you how this worked, because you see that the key was that everybody went for the longest time trying to replace the engine with the electric motor. And the genius of Toyota here was not that it replaced it, but it complemented it. Now, this is not me driving, and this is not my foot that's on there, but watch what happens here. You'll see the battery is being charged now, the battery is being used. Things are changing up here rapidly, much faster than any human being could do it, but great for the engine. This is an older Prius here because it's getting the old gas mileage. You can see when you put the gas on, use the engine more, it does 2 things. It charges the engine and it pushes the wheels, and your gas mileage lowers as a result. Go to the brakes, and the brakes generate electricity back into the battery through a servo motor. So wonderful way of describing this overall process, and it had to be matched in that fashion in order to get it right. Now, we've gone to EVs now, and people are using them more and more, but this was really the breakthrough that happened here. And yet in many organizations, they really don't have a good idea of what their business architecture looks like. And for goodness sake, don't ever show this type of a chart to management here. Start off much more simply. So we've talked about why it's important. Let's look at some specific building blocks in here. I'm going to go through these very briefly because they're really much more important as a checklist, but it is good checklist here. So it's worth just noting, which is just to say, what are we trying to do? We're trying to be the correct source of high quality reference and master data. And we hope to show lower costs throughout. In fact, if we don't show lower costs, we have not made a good return on investment for the organization. So we must show lower costs in order to do it. In there. And this, of course, should help leverage business intelligence or analytics efforts that we do. There are a whole series of activities that you need to look at in here. The key there is understand what the integration needs are, look at these sources and contributors, and most importantly, write them down so we don't have to rediscover them time after time. Once we've got them written down, we can now start to look at what the integration architecture should be and implement various types of solutions, looking for different types of matching, figuring out, doing the analysis to determine which is closest to the golden and how can we make sure the golden doesn't get polluted. I heard data poisoning for the first time the other day. I thought that was a really interesting term. It probably should be confined to misinformation rather than stretched to data quality in there, but that's again a different topic. Again, what are the various hierarchies? We looked at one earlier with the taxonomy. What are the affiliations? What groups are responsible for the data requirements assets, the data requirements, who has ownership of the data requirements at various portions throughout the life cycle? How do we do planning and integration? What do we do for replication? Because of course we can't store it in just one place, just as Google is stored in a distributed fashion around the organization. And then, of course, we've got to have a good change management system in place. We need to understand who are the users of the information and what data they can get. Don't try and start out with everything. Start out with just one piece. I'll show you that in just a minute. And how, in that analysis, are you able to advise people to say data is of this type in this source or this type in this source, and we're going to use these processes to reconcile it. And what do we do about valid values? What if we have a missing data? How the service level agreements account for all of that? What goes into this are things that complement things that your data group is already doing anyway, which is some form of cleansing, some form of understanding the requirements, documenting them, making sure that there is reliability in there. We've got the lineage that's in there, and then the various quality measures and reports. And finally, there's lots and lots of different roles and responsibilities here. Don't try and organize it all at once and get everybody to the table. Find a small subset of this group and build your team out of these so that they can gradually grow more expert over time. You'll see why. Just a second, let's first of all talk about technology, which is to say almost all organizations have some type of ETL capability. Yes, Microsoft and everybody else will sell you reference data applications. I'm going to suggest that you hold off on that for just a little bit. Same thing with master data as well. Most of you have a data modeling tool somewhere in the organization. If not, there are lots of free ones on the internet that you can get access to. Same thing with repositories. Again, go low tech in this case. That's a different talk. Go to data profiling. Again, a good SQL jockey can give you a whole lot of information from a profiling and cleansing perspective. In there, different types of tools will come into place. As you get more sophisticated, you can add business process and rule engines around this. And of course, underlying all of it needs to be these change management pieces. But the real key for this is to remember, of course, the wonderful saying, a fool with a tool is still a fool. And I hate to call organizations fool, but I've seen so much money wasted over the years doing master data management badly, and in horrendous waste of money. It's just atrocious here. So how should we do it then, Peter, if you're going to gripe about all of this? Well, I like to call it BYF, as in build your first master data management. Let's take an example here of a hospital. And even more so than the hospital, we're going to put within the hospital system the practice of determining admitting privileges. So where a physician is granted the ability to interact with different parts of the hospital system. When you go into the hospital, admitting privileges is widely understood to be a challenge in terms of managing it that's there. Every one of your organizations, I guarantee, has a SQL Server database jock that's down there somewhere that can just do wonderful things with SQL Server. And what do we want them to do? Well, first of all, we want them to look at system one, whatever that happens to be, and hopefully it's doing a lot with admitting, and instead take the admitting function out of system one and put it in just a very simple SQL Server database. not a lot of high volume access. I mean, how often do you need to actually do admitting privileges? There's not a super high volume activity here. So we can plan this to be careful. Then of course, the next thing you do is add that second system to it, but make sure that it hits, once again, that same SQL Server database that you built yourself with your internal resources. By the way, if you don't have them internally, I guarantee your local university would be quite happy to give you a good student who would be bored to tears in class, but would really jump at the chance to come and build one of these for your organization in order to do this. So we've now done MDM, if you will, for 3 systems by taking out of systems 1, 2, and 3, the master data management capabilities, which is just a validation system, folks, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot more than that under these circumstances, but it'll be some sort of rule-based system that eventually works in there. Now, where's the economy of scale come from? Well, of course, we don't want 3 sets of transfer technologies here. We want to enable communication via some sort of communication bus in there. And we're going to do it first to system 1, then to system 2, and then to system 3, because we've already defined those pieces. But over time, we can add system 4, system 5, system 6, and then finally system 7 and 8 in order to get the entire thing stacked up there. This allows us to build a SQL server here that services these systems. And when it's appropriate, it can be replaced for that 7-figure commercial master data management package. Or if you think you can get by with Microsoft, by all means, go for it from there as well. Let's take that concept of those systems that we cleaned up, if you will, and look at it in the context for another bank that did some work in that area. They were trying to learn their customers. They really hadn't seen their customers for years at a time, that people were just not showing up at branches and things. And so they developed this capability from the master data that they had, the 8 piles that they had, that gave them the ability to tell them when they had last been contacted. And that moved to a sort of forward deployed repository that was attached to the communication channels, that every time the consumer contacted the bank under any circumstances, walk in or card or anything, it did this latency check to see if they were one of the people they were trying to get a hold of and get additional information from in order to be able to serve them better. This architecture worked very, very well from an MDM perspective, because when they looked at external address coming in as well and other types of things, they were able to add it here very, very easily, because the existing architecture was well understood and appreciated in order to do this. In fact, the more complicated the architecture that you look at here, here's one that just was a customer scan. I took all the customer information out of it, but notice how integral master data is to that entire process. If they didn't have master data integrated with metadata, quality engineering, and knowledge practices in here, this particular activity that they were attempting to do would not function, nor would this one here, which was, again, the idea that on 2 different levels, there was monitoring that had to occur from an audit perspective, as well as actual practice application that kept them from incurring additional expenses and fines in that area. So these are some of the building blocks that you can start with in order to do this. And it is, in 90% of the cases, better for you to start it on your own instead of for somebody else to start it there. Because if you look at it as the way most people approach it, they spend too much money talking about something they really don't understand fully and how it'll fit their need, except that they've been told this is on the roadmap and it's now a, quote, safe technology. Well, I certainly agree, safe. Here are the old reports on failure. Most people were unsatisfied. People still spent 25% of their time duplicating data, and half spent $4 million a year on reference data. Again, we'd have to go into the surveys to find out, but it doesn't have a good reputation here. Again, these are complex projects where they're implemented as part of a project or something else, an IT effort, and it's separate from governance and quality, inappropriate technology, siloed mentalities. All this leads to big problems in those areas. I wish I knew who to give credit for this list. Whoops, I'm so sorry. I'm going to go back there. There we go. Again, I don't know who to give credit for this list. It's unfortunate. It's absolutely not mine, but it's got to have something that people recognize in it. If you're walking the halls, the cube farms of company X in a couple of years, and somebody says to you, I didn't know where to put it, so I stuck it in the MDM, we have not gotten away with what we need to get to in terms of education. Again, small, careful steps, setting expectations, adopting the right architecture up front, and making sure that there are incentives in order to do it correctly, incentives to do it the right way instead of fast and cheap way on here. Again, strong alignment with strategy, a necessary component here. Again, pick some sort of framework to evaluate the entire process, make sure you've got high-level sponsors. Again, I don't need to go on and describe all of this with you, but having a good business case is key to this, because organizations are simply not going to allow you to spend, say $18 billion and then ask the question, what did the shareholders get from that expenditure of 18 billion? Again, same kind of here. This is from a tips for best practice that are up there, but you can see here that the last piece, the most important, is test, test, and test again. We have to keep working with this, because we don't know, unless our process is formally, our architecture is formally managed, as we don't know how good the fit is. And if we don't have the right fit, things will be very uncomfortable for folks. So guiding principles, shared reference and master data belongs to the organization. Don't let anybody own it as an organizational asset. It is far too important to do that. Somebody can be the steward, and almost stewardship is governed by phases of the life cycle. So that's a good way to think about it. You can have ownership of the data requirements during phase X of this data's life cycle. That's a good way to give people ownership of something if they want to own something. But owning the data, most harmful thing you can do in an organization. Again, it's a quality project, right? So we're not going to do this. I've said that so wrong, and I apologize. Let me say it again. It's a quality program, because the goals cannot be achieved from a project management perspective. Again, forgive me for messing that up, but it was absolutely the right way the second time that I said it. The stewards are accountable for determining these golden values, which means they need to know where the data comes from upstream and where it's going downstream, as well as what happens to it while it's under their care. But the golden values represent the best, the most valuable sources of data on this topic for the organization. And that we can replicate this, but from only golden sources. And more importantly, we control the replication. So we know when we update it in one place, where else it has to be updated around there. Reference data and master data generally require formal change management of one sort or another, or it doesn't work well within that context here. What I want to close here with, not quite close, but the last thing I'm going to show you today is a wonderful little articulation of master data management. This came from Dave Evans, who was a colleague at British Telecom, and he gave me the little film that I'm going to show you to share, and I'm giving you the link so that you can play this for your organization as well, if you feel so interested in describing this. But I want you to watch this less than 1 minute film and imagine that it has come, because it did, from the chairman of British Telecom. Now, most people pay attention when the chair of British Telecom mails them something. So when they clicked on this, of course, today it would be seen as a phishing scheme and they wouldn't be allowed to open it at all. But when they were allowed to do this, they got this neat little story here. So I'm going to just stop talking here and play you this little story, and hopefully it'll come through on the information for you. Wonderful articulation, first of all, and again, thanks always to Dave for allowing us to share it here. But what happened here, and less than 60 seconds was a very carefully crafted message that said, we used to duplicate things because we weren't managing as well as we could, and not just duplicate, but it was a bit messy, right? That was the understatement in the whole thing. So we're now going to store our information. And remember, this is from the chairman of British Telecom. They were able to measure the employee read rate, and in fact, found that many employees, most of the employees, in fact, were able to recall that there were 7 sisters in this technology solution. And many of them were even able to remember the names of the 7 master files into which British Telecom was going to do this. This video did more to sell and explain master data management to British Telecom than most of the effort that I've seen in most communication efforts around trying to sell what is going on in these organizations to come up with this. It's just crazy how little information is spent on the communication here. So we've spent a bit of time here, and I'm going to spend a bit of time wrapping up here, but we talked about data management in here, and then what is reference and master data management? Why are they important? And what sort of building blocks can we have, with my recommendation to you being to start on your own? It's quite easy in order to implement that first piece. And there we've talked about some guiding principles and best practices, but as I said before, these are mainly in the form of checklists so that you can check them off in your way on this. We'll now do a little bit on takeaways as we get into the Q&A section. So here is the first process model, if you will, or the input-output diagram from the DIMBOK regarding master data management system. You can see here we start out each of these with a definition: planning, implementation, and control activities to ensure consistency with that golden version of contextual data values. That means when Peter makes a call on Peter's phone, Peter's bill gets charged appropriately for that phone call. If assume he's not on an unlimited plan, but don't worry, the phone company still counts everything that's there, that's in their DNA, if you will, around that. So let's move from there. What is the goals then of master data management? It's to provide an authoritative source, and that's really the changing hearts and minds in the organization going forward. Everybody understands that, again, I'll say Peter is responsible for maintaining the proper address of all of our customers that we're looking at, that Peter is lowering costs and complexity through these reuse and leverage activities in here, and that all of this data flows into analytics efforts that are downstream from it. So this supports the entirety of all data efforts that are going on. So what are the inputs? Well, the business priorities. If we don't start off with strategy, shame on us. This is the only way we're going to link to anything meaningful in terms of dollars or valuation components in here. We need to understand data requirements. Luckily, those exist. The real problem is not that there is one version of it, that there's probably 10 or 15 versions of those data requirements. And our job as master data management is to synthesize them into something there. Guided, of course, by policy and regulation, specific code sets that our ERPs allow, because we're not going to go back to the ERP vendors and add more codes. If it's a good ERP, it'll have the ability to extend codes internally. Looking at the sets of master data and transactional data that are within there, we've got all sorts of suppliers of these requirements depending on your organization. Something like the US Army has already existing groups that do a great job of transmitting this information upwards. Other groups haven't been as mature in their practice areas here and are relying on more organic type of growth around that. There is a whole series of participants here. Key is data stewardship. Most organizations don't have a good stewardship program, but it's something that you should be looking at. They're on the similar experience curve, the similar portion of the hype curve. You're always going to have subject matter experts, and again, borrow the appropriate data professionals as well as IT professionals from other parts of the organization in order to make it work. What are we going to do? Well, there's 10 things in here. And again, I won't walk through each of these with you, but these are 10 activities. Don't start with 10 of them. Pick one. If you do that well, add a second, right? That's really the way to approach this, because it's a very complex process. What are the deliverables? Well, we'll have some requirements. And again, those are most valuable because those can be used after you've had a chance to develop them for 3 years in your search of finding the absolute correct software package to replace your homegrown system that you will eventually outgrow. Lots of documents and models, metrics and reports, lots of consumers, and this is where you find your value. What impact is having this data cleaned up make to us? If none, then don't bother to clean it up. What measures should we use to look around all of this? And what tool set are we using in order to pull all of this together? Again, notice what we've done here as well, labeled them as planning, control, development, and operational. So a very nice way of describing all of these different components that you're looking at around this. I'm going to leave you with a set of references that come along here that are good, relatively dated, but very, very good references that allow you to go in and access this sort of information. Of course, remind you of our upcoming events. Next month, we're going to do one talking about gaining business and executive support. So everything that I said today, we now need to translate into business speak around this. And with that, Shannon, we're back over to you.
Peter, thank you so much for another great presentation. As always appreciated. If you have questions for Peter, feel free to put them in the Q&A portion of your screen. And just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording, along with anything else requested. So diving in here, Peter, it seems like there's some even more confusion. So what is the big difference between master and reference data?
Excellent question. I probably went too fast and I apologize for that. So let's
That's good.
jump back up to that section here. So the key is that reference data is this first little golden dot that's on this diagram. And it's looking at things like, what countries do we do business in? And can a person have multiple accounts? What controlled vocabulary items are we going to use? Remember the tank example that I gave. The bigger yellow dot on the screen there, those reference data, by the way, control the master data, because the master data is only allowed to hold those values. You can only hold one of those 9 gender codes if your data was governed by the Canadian Social Security system during the time period that I was describing in there. The master data items are not governed by reference pieces, but are generally governed by some sort of customs and things like, are you a member of our premium club? Are you authorized to do that particular activity? Or are you using a standard format, XLS format, or a CSV format if we're bringing things into key? And those master data items then control all the rest of this. And I neglected to say I got permission from my colleague Chris Bradley to use this, because he's the one that came up with this really nice articulation. Transactions are things like $5, right? That's how much I paid for my sandwich that day. Or was that transaction in fact authorized? Or I happen to like something on a social media site. Each of those are going to be transaction data. So reference controls the accessible data values. Master data controls access to the system's capabilities that are in there. And the transaction data are the instances of the values that come out of that. I hope that clears it up. It's a really good question. Certainly something I want you to take away from today.
Perfect. So, so how do we take all of these things that we're learning from you and apply to our own experience in industry? Where can we find some real world examples of master and reference data for specific industries? I work in higher ed, and master and reference data for my institutions are likely to be different from a healthcare or financial services organization. Hey there.
There you faded out. Yeah, you said, I heard higher education, but that's when it faded out.
Oh, so it says where can we find real world examples of master and reference data for specific industries? I work in higher ed. Master and reference data for my institutions are likely to be different from a healthcare or financial organization.
They are, in fact. And if you are in an institute of higher ed, go around and look for either your institutional researcher or your chief data officer or the person who's responsible for the university census. So if you can imagine in a university, are we really happy that we have lots of kids taking lots of classes, or do we have an instance and more that kids are taking classes in a way that will ensure success for them to be successful going on the outside of this? that there is somebody at your university who pays extraordinarily careful attention to exactly how that number is calculated to make sure that it is reported on in a standard format, because it is one of the primary things that your university uses to measure that. So the definition of what that census data is likely to be reference data, and then the students making up that census are the master data that would be in that, just to go back to that first questioner. As far as examples go, it is kind of harder to find things because people aren't, even though they are very, very happy to celebrate the successes that they've done, getting people to sit down and put this into a book has been one of the more difficult things I found in life. And you're speaking to the author of 12 books at this point. What you will find, though, and I'll just put in a plug for it, the DGIQ is coming up in June, and Enterprise Data World is coming up in Anaheim in September. People love to get on stage and talk about these things, talk about their successes. And I would urge you to look over the programs of those two events coming up and just see what sorts of examples are going to be there, because that's one of the things that Shannon and her team do, is try to present a broad approach to these various sections. Shannon, I'll let you jump in if you want to say anything more to this, but it's certainly a good question. And it's just, you'll find that people, it's easier to talk about it than it is to write about it. So you're more likely to find them talking about it. But I'll keep my eyes open for some. I know that Doug Laney has a new book. What is it, 100 data stories or something in there? There might be some stories in there. Each one's just a page long, so it's kind of hard to, or 1 or 2 pages long. So it's kind of hard to tell, but I'm not aware of anything specific for higher ed. I'll give you another example, though. Higher ed is actually quite a lot like, in some ways, a think tank. And so I've done some work for some of the think tanks around DC who do some really interesting work and would astound universities at their productivity. They are phenomenally good at this process. If universities could hire a couple of those folks in there, they would double their productivity rates around that. I got us a little bit off topic. The question was, where can we find examples? I think the safest place is to go to events in person where people are talking about them. You'll find a lot of things that are communicated that way that aren't always going to get the time and effort that they would require to be put in written format. Not everybody has the luxury of being a university professor like I do. And so it's a bit tougher of a process, but it is easier for them to get up and more fun for them to get up and talk about it. Yeah, cats that we have around the thing. It's just wonderful. Anyway, have I shilled enough for you, Shannon? Is that a good one? That's a very appropriate question.
Yeah, I like it. And I like the reference to DGIQ coming up in June, because networking, as you say, is just some of
And
the
you're
best
about to sell out.
ways.
You sold out in December, right?
Yeah, we are about to sell out in June too. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So, but lots of opportunities. We'll do it again and again. So, how would you manage the people change management element when establishing MDM?
Excellent question. And the first thing is, what is your organization? If you work for a branch of the US government, they already have these services available to you. The government realized a long time ago it was tough to change large organizations. So they built their own change management capabilities and expertise. Go back to that slide with the ice cube. They ice cube. That's a big ice cube, isn't it? The iceberg. There goes the word I was looking for. They are the ones who recognize this as a problem and have done a really good job of it. Some of the larger organizations have done the same kind of approach here as well. So first, look for it internally. If it's not available internally, there are companies that will rent you these services that can be used to encourage that, and they can come in on a as needed basis, which is maybe very appropriate. But they will tell you the parameters of what needs to happen, because you're right. It isn't work just to say, here's good quality data and now go use it, because people don't actually know what to do. Again, great question. Thank you for that. I love making that point.
Indeed. So, a cogent definition of what is master data management is essential, as opposed to presenting so many fallacies, perspectives, and so much breadth of content. This may be set the context to the topic, but it's not helping understand what is and what should be MDM. So, I think there's just a lot of confusion around
let's go back to the easy definition then.
Yeah.
Again, I'm so sorry you all are confused, but here we go. So the key is to understand that what we're talking about are the persons, places, and things that the organization does business with. And that's as good a definition as you're going to be able to pull out of any of these. What you're going to have to work on internally, so sorry I went by that, there we go. Internally is, well, when does something rise to the occasion that it's worth including in that group of data that gets managed specially? All right, so let me give you a couple of examples here, because again, as you said, Shannon, there's clearly confusion, and we don't want you guys to walk away confused. That's a bad idea. So if I'm looking at the places that I'm doing business with, again, I may decide that I'm going to do business in one state to start with, or one city. But clearly, if I have dreams of success, I should somehow make sure that I get into an architectural construct that allows me to do business all around the world. Most people plug into the Amazon platform when they run into that particular set of requirement that's there. But then where do your places become? The same places that, in this case, Amazon is able to do business with, and that you've shifted then the burden from you to Amazon. Of course, you're paying more in order to do that, but that is still a form of that reference data. Parties might be certainly Amazon. You're going to pay your Amazon Web Services bill on a monthly basis, but you also have people that you're working with. And this is where it gets interesting. And the reason we abstract it up to parties is because if we just leave it as people, I can be both a person and I can be a vendor to the organization that I am a part of, with proper disclosure and transparency rules that are at play. So you can see you wouldn't want to have just be only a customer or only an employee, but you might have to be able to take on multiple roles, which is why we call them parties. And then of course the things, what we're going to manage things. Remember, the hard part of this is finding out where you should apply your time and effort. So if I'm looking at a pencil in front of me, do I really want to take that and give it a serial number and track its use? Well, if pencils were key to the business process that we knew about, then it would be easy to tell, and be very productive in order to do that. But if it's just a byproduct of what I do, I can't call it overhead and don't manage it. So, okay, I'm not managing a pencil. Should I manage a lunchbox? I don't know about that. Should I manage a phone? Well, they're kind of small. I dropped mine in the creek last week, was offline for 5 days. It was wonderful. But you better believe the management of that exact phone is something that is tracked by multiple organizations. That's a thing that is tracked from a master data management perspective. And I think the master data management key is something called an EIM, if I recall correctly. So again, hopefully that helps from the master data management perspective. Then the value, what, for example, if I was going to say that any party can have any gender value as long as it's one of the 9 that I showed, then that simply says those restrict that to it. You can tell that may or may not be a good business decision, because depending on what you look at, I think Facebook has defined 63 of them at this point, and you certainly don't want to be offensive or leave anybody out, but you also can't be completely comprehensive about it. So most organizations adopt a standard. This is one that was showing that the FBI adopted the one that the Canadian Social Security system had, probably because they didn't want to argue about it, and it was more expansive than theirs, which may have just been male and female. And I'm completely conjecturing on that. But do you see how this would be reference data? Each of those values then are the things that go into determining the context for the next component here, which is again the parties that you're working with that. So I hope I've explained that. And again, thank you for asking the questions. That's what we're here for. Back to you, Shannon.
Perfect. So it seems like it helps if you have it kind of some training in data modeling to understand this better. And would you say that master data is the access to define the data model?
If we are going, good question. If we are going to make a common platform for this, and I'll go back to the one I drew you on the screen here, then absolutely knowledge of that model is an absolute must. All right, so if you recall this slide here again, context of a hospital working on the admitting privileges piece, and they're going to understand the data model that's in that SQL Server database and have that information provided back to System 1. And if we're going to do it this way, the way I'm advocating, I'd better have the same data model in that SQL Server database that serves System 1, 2, and 3. And in fact, of course, this was the system was clearly going to get very complex very quickly. So we blow that system away, and then we put in our spoken hub kind of an approach that allows us to go out and connect to the various systems, bring them on board as the value proposition warrants. One of the things that's so frustrating is that organizations will say, well, I've got to have all my master data defined. No, 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 no. Defining some of it will help. Absolutely, but having to have all of it is not a necessary prerequisite to success in order to do this. So finding a subset of your data and determining whether managing it with the overhead that you have now gained from experience learning this process on that, this will now allow you to determine the value proposition. You can say, you know, these 8 systems are good enough for us. We know that it costs X to bring on a new system, so we should bring on a new system only when we can receive X plus in value in order to do this. And then our scope can be increased gradually. But so many organizations take a complete approach going all the way from A to Z, and it just does not turn out to be productive, which is an issue and why we have such high failure rates in this area. Again, great question. And of course, the question was about the data model. If I'm not using common data models throughout this entire process, I have no ability to communicate. Remember that data has to exist perfectly at the most granular level in order to work. If I'm truncating fields or otherwise evolving the data in one form or another, I'm risking misunderstanding that occurs in there. And again, there's examples of misunderstanding that we can talk about in terms of that, but that's really the confusion that exists prior to an organization implementing this as one of their first steps towards increasing the maturity of their data management practices or as an organization. That was a mouthful, but I said it all, Shannon. Again, great question.
I like it. We got about 10 minutes for some more great questions that are coming in. So keep them coming. Is in the higher ed example, would list of courses, is that reference data and list of students master data?
Well, probably the list of courses are going to be also master data in there. Certainly the students would be. In our university, we use a system called Banner. It's very popular throughout the university community, and each student is assigned a V as in Victor number. Everybody must know their V number as a student because that's what gets tied to all of your grades and your charges and everything else around that. The list of courses would also be there because the reference data would be, we can offer courses in these time slots. For example, one of the things we ended up doing, we had an expansion into an Arab country and we had to change our times courses are offered. We used to offer them Monday through Fridays, but in some Arab countries, Friday and Saturday are the holy days. And consequently, we don't offer classes there, but we do offer them on Sundays. So that required a change to the reference data about courses that were being offered, and then those courses could be offered. I don't have time to sketch it for you here, but I'm pretty sure I'm talking to a fellow data modeler and they are with me in terms of the tracking on that. So hopefully that's a good explanation. List of students, certainly master data. List of students' genders would be reference data. List of courses, also master data. Lists of offering slots or modalities or other types of attributes of courses would fall into the reference category. And of course, if you can't manage that standard, you can never get to that organizational census. And again, as I said before, that is one of the most critical data items that is produced on a university basis on a semesterly schedule. Thank you for a great question.
Indeed, I love it. I love the drill down. What about a strategy to test the data management strategy?
It's a good piece. Remember, the guidance there is that strategy should be much more of a process in nature than it is a thing. The corollary to that statement is Mike Tyson, who said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And it's a wonderful way of describing what happens when you actually encounter things in the world. So plans don't usually work 99% of the time. But if your plan or your strategy was such that we should err on the side of everyday low price, just to take an example with which I am familiar, and if I'm faced with uncertainty and I err on the side of everyday low price, that is something that can guide every knowledge worker in the organization. Similarly, as you're developing your master data management system architecture, that architecture should be guided by the same strategic principles. How can I make sure that when people are faced with a choice, they err on the side of whatever in that type of a context? Again, strategy can be a simple as skate to where I think the puck is going to be in the case of Wayne Gretzky, or the example can be hit the army right here at this dividing point. Hopefully they'll fall back in different directions, and then we'll all turn to the right and surround them and beat them, and then we'll turn to the left. Again, great plan, didn't work out so well in the execution of that Napoleon. But you see that it's got to be this thought that says, as I'm designing this system, this is the purpose. And if, again, it's going to come up to speed, quality, or schedule in that sense, and risk. And those are the four components in there. And if you don't know which side, at least to do that, then you have a basis for making a decision around architectural types of concepts. So I'm, again, lecturing a bit here, but it's a nice opportunity. And thank you for the question. It's a good one.
Indeed. So there is a perception in certain organizations that buying an MDM tool will resolve all of our problems. So what are the possible due diligence that organizations must do from planning to a delivery before committing to these expensive solutions? Do we really need to buy a full-fledged tool to show the value of MDM?
I hope what I spent my time here on this slide building for you all convinces you that you can do this as a learning exercise. And that is what I'm urging you to do. Most organizations, when they enter into discussions with the MDM vendors, have a large challenge of communicating. And that's because your organization speaks a certain language and the vendor is expert in their technology. They want to impress you in that area, nothing wrong with that. But it's better for you to have 3 years of experience under your belt, doing it this way, achieving MDM results, understanding and being able to put a value proposition. If you've done this 8 times by the time you enter into discussion and the vendor comes at you and says, we're going to charge you 7 figures for this, you can look at them and say, I can do it on my own for a lot less. So you've got to argue quite differently if you want to get us as a customer around that. It's unfortunately, it's just a situation that we've allowed the vendors, who are absolutely a necessary part of this equation, to not tell people. Again, when I'm working with groups, I never say it's easy, but our goal is trying to make it easier. And there's a fine distinction between there. And if management can't understand that distinction, and they think that just going out and spending, again, I saw one organization that flew in 3 plane load of Deloitte consultants every week for 26 weeks to get their MDM stood up. Again, 8 figures in that particular instance. And the thing was a complete failure. On that. They did it, technically it worked, but they treated it as an IT project and they simply were unable to operationalize it. And again, if I put 10, excuse me, I said 8 figures into it, if I put 8 figures into something there, I better be finding some sort of return on that. And I don't see how you can achieve that return without doing the homework here first. So replay this portion of the presentation or whatever if you didn't get it. I really do believe, and I've seen a lot of organizations that have achieved very good results by building their own form, first of all, and then after they've gained experience with this, having a much more educated conversation with the vendors based on their increased knowledge and practice, where they can start to say, hey, we've sketched out our process architecture. It looks like this. How about, or how would I change the parameters on your system to meet those requirements if it was going this and that way? Sorry, I got a fart in my throat there. Anyway, great question and good luck with it. And if you want I'm always available to rent, to yell at your management, because that's what you do with consultants like me. You push us up in front of them, say, shoot this guy first, right? Perfectly okay in order to do that. That's kind of our role in life. We like giving organizations bad news and just saying, that's an awful lot like the way this worked out over here, and it was very expensive and it didn't produce the results that they wanted to have. By the way, most organizations aren't implementing it at this stage of their career as a lark. I mean, they're probably been told to do it or advised to do it in one form or another. So find out, what is the source of that advice? What are they telling you? Why are they telling you to do that? And what should you take a look at it for? Remember, we're on a very good trajectory here with respect to master data management. And that is to say that we're starting to learn what we know and what we don't know. We've been through the rough part of the hype cycle. We've exercised the beta, if you want to think of it that way. We're not out of the woods, and that's why waiting for others to learn about the slope of enlightenment and where we can jump onto that bandwagon makes perfectly good sense. By doing a little bit of it on our own, getting good at the process, and then having conversations with the vendors and being an educated customer of the part. By the way, the vendors don't mind you being educated. They're just impatient that it takes time to become educated, but you can't read a book on it and be an expert. I can tell you that for sure. Great question. Anyway, thanks, Jen. I know we're running out of time here.
It's good. We have a couple more minutes left, but that is actually the end of the questions. I saw in the chat that there was a link to an example of MDM for a university. So take a look at that. Thank you for that example. Yeah, I think that's it, Peter. Well, really appreciate it. It's been another great presentation as always. Thanks to all of our attendees for being so engaged in everything we do. Just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording as well. So thanks, y'all. Thanks, Peter.
Have a lovely afternoon, Shannon, and thank you all for joining us and spending time with us.
Thanks, y'all.